Hello, so this is my latest video and I want to talk about Goblin Market. Now, as you've probably noted, it's absolutely massive, so rather than go through the whole thing, I'm just going to focus purely on comparing it to A Doll's House. Remember, in the exam this counts as 2 poems because of its length. It has lots of themes. One of the best things is it has multiple interpretations, so it's an absolutely brilliant one to use. The comparisons to A Doll's House might not seem obvious at first, but actually the more you go through it, the more things you'll notice, especially the more subtle ones. So this was written in 1859 and then first published in 1862, and just as a bit of context, this is the poem that made Rossetti really famous as a poet. It was part of a collection, Goblin Market and Other Poems, and it was absolutely huge. The PowerPoints you would have looked at had lots of stuff about the context of how it was written, how it was renamed, and a really important thing to remember is that she was volunteering with fallen women at the penitentiary around the time she wrote it, and that comes quite key with the themes of sisterhood later on. So let's start. We start off, obviously, and I've marked it in green in my text, as you can see, where the goblins speak. Now, interestingly, although again you wouldn't really need this in the exam because it's more an analysis, she uses a very different sort of meter for the goblins, again to show that sort of discordance, which is similar to how Maud Clare comes in and interrupts the wedding. But anyway, in case you're wondering, the SoundCloud is in reference to the wonderful audio version we have of this. If you haven't listened to it with Shelley Henderson, it's on our intranet. Go and have a listen from 3 minutes 25. It's amazing. Anyway, so we start off, and the big thing I think is quite worth mentioning is this very long introduction, which I'll just try and pan down, where we have all the different fruits, and there's about 30 or so in total. Some of them are very kind of English, like pears, and then some of them are very exotic. So immediately we have the sense of the unusual, things that aren't quite right. One interpretation of the poem is sort of a Marxist anti-capitalist interpretation, and I think that works quite well to compare with A Doll's House and the idea of the middle classes. So if you think about the Helmer's house with all the furnishings, there's lots of references to the wealth of Helmer and how pretty the house is and how well kept it is. And again, a bit like the fruit here, this idea of having too much, the excessive, which I guess would have been a symbol of wealth at that time, and especially if the middle classes were trying to show their wealth. So obviously we have set up with the sisters who are kind of coming to come face to face with these goblins, literally or not, later on. And you just got this idea of the 2 different sisters representing the 2 different thoughts. Laura, who wants to listen, and Lizzie, who doesn't. And this idea of men being quite negative compared to the female characters. If you think about Krogstad, now he starts off the play in A Doll's House as being kind of this antagonist, and what's interesting is by the end of the play he actually is very sympathetic, whereas here, if we have this idea that they are male antagonists, they remain negative the whole way through. Laura doesn't realise quite how bad they are at this point. She's kind of swept away with it, and it's only later when we see their real violence against Lizzie. So this idea of masculine antagonism, or sort of masculinity or male authority, I mean, they're not really an authority figure, but they certainly are very masculine. They're called goblin men here, as you'll see. Anyway, and the wealth of the items that they have. Now, some of these comparisons are going to seem fairly arbitrary, but one thing I quite like is this idea of where they try to persuade her to pay for the food with her hair. Now, obviously this often gets referred to as sort of symbolic of selling her body, sexualization, but what's interesting is if you compare that to Nora in A Doll's House, and how she refers to herself as having to live hand to mouth, and she survives by giving herself to Torvald's sort of she doesn't call herself a slave, but she performs tricks for him. She refers to herself as a fairy and things like that. At one point she'll dance for him and sing for him. So this idea that both texts feature these female characters who in some way are selling themselves out to male characters, and in both of them there's this sort of sexual undertone here, although it's quite subtle. Anyway, so obviously she gets the fruit, she has a grand old time, and then she heads back to see Lizzie, who obviously is an interesting figure. We've got this idea of full of wise upbraidings here, and Lizzie reminds me quite a bit of Christine in A Doll's House, who is obviously the wiser one, the older one of the two, and tries to give advice to Nora, who she feels is being quite naive for going behind her husband's back, and then for later for her relationship with Rank. So this idea of you have these sort of female characters who are slightly more knowledgeable and experienced, trying to help the Nora or Laura type characters who get into trouble based on their naivety and, well, their temptations, I suppose. And that's a really nice comparison between the two there, that they are tempted by these worlds they shouldn't be part of. So if we move on, obviously you start then having the issues with the sisters, where they are becoming quite different. And again, although it's not a clear comparison, we can see the contrast, whereas they were in harmony before, and now there's a sense of disharmony or discord between them, that they have gone from sleeping, you know, arm in arm, to now being quite different as a result of what I guess is Laura's transgression. A very small thing which I really like here, but I kind of am a bit obsessed with this image, is when they are returning home, there's an image of a bank. So Laura's kind of hanging around, and then she says here, the bank was steep, and this idea that she is unable to climb back up towards the house. Now that compares to lots of images we've had of redemption. I talked in my uphill poem video about that as well, and how that compares to both Christine and Krogstad, and that symbol of the stairs in A Doll's House. So at this point, when she has transgressed, she's unable to go up the steep slope because of it. Obviously then we have the goblins coming back, and then Laura realizes that she's unable to hear them. And interestingly, at this point, she you'll see this line here, which I absolutely love. She starts to kind of panic as she realizes that she is completely isolated, that she can no longer hear them. And it's quite similar to kind of the state that Nora is in. Nora is kind of driven to madness when she is waiting, and you'll see that throughout towards, you know, as the tension's building throughout the play, when she's waiting for the letter from Krogstad to come, she's waiting for her secret to be revealed. And again, this sort of transformation into this sort of primal, this reference to gnashing her teeth and things like that, this kind of over emotional. And then you've got lots of references, you've probably studied hysteria as well, and this idea that women can't cope with their emotions. You also have a really key point here which goes nicely with Nora, and this idea is a transformation. And actually Laura has two transformations in this poem. Nora kind of has one throughout the play. And the key symbol there, which I've just circled the word hair, we'll see this in a second at the end of the poem, so keep an eye on that. But if you think about Nora when she does the Tarantella dance, that's a symbol of her kind of losing control and facing her fate, or kind of getting to the point where she can face her fate. And interestingly here we've got Laura, who's kind of, because she can't get any more fruit, she's sort of breaking down. So we move on. Now you then have, I think, the key part. Laura is starting to die, so Lizzie goes to save her, And then I just wanted to make this point. She goes to face the goblin men, and interestingly she does that, and I've written it here already, she interrupts them. So you've got this idea of Lizzie and her power here. Now obviously in the play, Nora's growing power throughout the play is really important. So here the fact that Lizzie's able to interrupt them, unlike her sister who kind of just did what they said, shows her power. She also shows this power with the penny. Now again, it's quite a small symbol, but it's a symbol of her independence. And remember, that's a thing with Nora, that Nora is not self-sufficient. She has to get money from her husband. So the symbol of, and it's why, of course, Laura had to give her hair. She didn't have money, whereas Lizzie does. So again, this idea of a symbolic, independent woman here. Anyway, we then have, and I think this is where it's really interesting to think about the goblins being this sort of male antagonist here, especially when you compare them to Krogstad, this is when they go from being purring with wagging tails and being quite animal, like cutesy, to then becoming primal and aggressive. And that compares, ironically, with Krogstad, who doesn't end the play like this. He actually changes into quite a sympathetic character, or Torvald, who obviously when he gets the letter and finds out the truth, then becomes very aggressive and kind of symbolically violent towards Nora. He never actually hurts her, but by threatening to cut her off from her children. So I think this idea of gender in this poem is really interesting to compare to A Doll's House in that sense. Now, I mentioned that thing about the bank. This is such a small point, but I just think it's really cool. Now, Lizzie, having had all the fruit shoved in her face and kind of laughing to herself, she is able to spring up the bank, so she can run back up it, even though her sister couldn't. So again, this idea of redemption, that she, unlike her sister, unlike Krogstad, unlike Christine, is able to kind of support herself and do the right thing, and according to Rossetti, get to heaven. Another key symbol for Lizzie, and as I said here, this image of Jesus and self-sacrifice, she brings the fruit back to her sister, and the eat me, drink me, love me is very much a symbol of Jesus here and his self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice is a really key part in the play as well. Christine does it, Anne-Marie does it, and the miracle that Nora wanted from Torvald was for him to destroy his reputation to save her, and he wouldn't do it. So this very much so is kind of the opposite, that Lizzie did the thing she wasn't going to do. She went against her own kind of beliefs and her own fears, whereas Torvald failed that test, as it were. And you've got this idea of the forbidden fruit here, which is kind of a key symbol. Lots of people talk about the macaroons in A Doll's House. I think the macaroons are one thing, but I think it's more what they represent. And I think for Nora, they represent power. Now, whether that's power from work or power from eating macaroons behind her husband's back, they're a symbol of power which she's not supposed to have. And I think, even though there is a sexual element here with the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve and things, I think there's more to it than just kind of saying for Nora the macaroons. Now, last thing, or the last couple of points, you then have Laura, having had the fruit again, she then has this sort of almost like an allergic reaction. So wormwood being like a poison to her tongue. And interestingly, her hair streaming, her locks stream like the torch, is very much like Nora in the Tarantella. And she asks Christine to help her get her hair back up afterwards. So again, this is the second transformation. And obviously for Laura, it's a good thing because she is reborn. And Nora is to an extent, but in a very different way. So this idea of rebirth and transformation are quite key in both. And then obviously the happy ending, as it were, when she has been saved. I just want to draw your attention to this line. Life out of death. Nora leaves the house at the end and is ordered to get a new life. Laura in this poem nearly dies but is then reborn. So a nice image here of rebirth to go with redemption that we've seen. And the last thing, just very quickly, is this image of sisterhood as against brotherhood. And that is really nicely symboled by Christine and Nora. It's not always perfect, but of course it's one way of self-preservation for women in the play and in the poem. So I hope there were some interesting points for you to think about, and best of luck. Enjoy reading through more. Bye.